Good morning, guys. Welcome to Glasgow Rangers Nation. I'm Owen James, and this is all your latest Rangers news. We are in the midst of this international break yet again. Another boring break of international football. As I'll repeat what I've said on numerous occasions, I genuinely do not see the point of international football. It genuinely is one of the biggest wastes of time. It's just our players going off to play for their countries, possibly get injured, and we have to pay their wages. And I know national FAs pay some sort of compensation, whatever, but it's still us that suffer long term if these players get injured. And you know what? It's a waste of time. And I genuinely couldn't give a monkeys who, if England win against Andorra or Scotland get a draw away in Denmark, my God, it's like winning the World Cup for some Scotland fans. I genuinely couldn't give a monkeys. Genuinely couldn't give a monkeys. Anyway, we're going to talk all things Rangers. It's obviously no Rangers football, but there's still a lot going on around the club now. Kevin Thelwell obviously has given his backing to Russell Martin. There have been stories doing the rounds from some slightly dodgy sources. I think it was Football Insider that came out saying that Rangers are planning to sack Russell Martin after the international break, which, you know, I think if he was going to get the sack, he'd sack him out at the start of the international break to give whoever the new manager is a time to come in and kind of settle into things. I still think that the board won't move to sack him yet. I still think they'll see it as way too early. I think any sacking, if it came, would come sort of Christmas time. But I genuinely think we're stuck with Russell Martin for the rest of the season, which I think is a massive mistake for the club. I genuinely do. You know, if you look at the situation that he left Southampton in when he left, playing boring shit football and looking like a club heading backwards at a rapid rate of knots, you know, I think hanging on to him is actually going to be detrimental to the club in the long term. But hey, look, who am I to say? I'm not Andrew Kavanagh. I'm not Parag Marathe. I'm not Kevin Thelwell. But as we said, you know, Kevin Thelwell hardly got the most stellar of records in terms of signing or doing particularly well at Everton. I know people talked about him, you know, obviously talk pro Kevin Thelwell in terms of the fact that, you know, he signed these players and he kept Everton up. He spent an absolute fortune and Everton were absolutely shite. Trust me, as someone obviously who sees English Premiership football, Everton were shite. And they seem to be doing a lot better now. They've got a new sporting director and a new manager. There we go. Anyway, look, one of the big issues around the club at the moment is the future of Niko Raskin. Now, Kevin Thelwell did say that once the international break was over and all the players had returned to Auchenhowie, that Raskin, his representatives, Thelwell and Martin would sit down for clear the air talks. Now, whether the result of those clear the air talks is positive or negative, we don't know until they actually happen. Now, Russell Martin did include Niko Raskin in his Europa League squad, which does sort of bode well that he does see a future for him. You know, you wouldn't put him in that squad and then be stuck with him in that squad if you didn't think he had a future, or if you didn't think you were going to use him at some point, because, you know, realistically, you can't afford to leave players out and then obviously go, shit, we've got a player now that's not actually going to take part in the squad. Now, we heard Neil McCann's take on Niko Raskin after the recent Old Firm game, in which both McCann and Boyd both kind of concluded that Rangers would have had a better chance of beating Celtic, a very poor Celtic team who look on the verge of implosion themselves, had Niko Raskin started. And I personally believe that if Raskin had started that game against Celtic at Ibrox, we probably would have won it, actually, with his drive and his talent in the midfield. Now, last season, at the end of last season, the last sort of from January onwards, Raskin was by far the best player in the Rangers squad. He was the best player in Scotland. He was one of the best players in the Europa League tournament. I remember games where he absolutely bossed it, including away against Fenerbahce. You know, he absolutely bossed it, absolutely ran that game. He obviously played for Belgium as well last season, bossed games for them, looked as good as De Bruyne, Tielemans, Lukaku, Faze, all those players. You know, these top players who play in some of the top leagues around Europe, and Raskin looked every bit the same as him. And I think, you know, there was a kind of correlation, I think, a little bit between the fact that Barry Ferguson, obviously, who was an outstanding midfielder in his day, you know, one of the greatest midfielders Rangers have ever had. As a player and a captain, Barry was just awesome, absolutely amazing, and absolute legend. I'll always love Barry for what he did on the field for Rangers. And, I think the Raskin developed and improved under Barry because of Barry's tutelage, because of knowing Barry being able to pass on to him what he did, how he played, how he developed, and what he did for the club. And I think that certainly helped. Now, as I said, we got Neil McCann's take the other day, as regards Niko Raskin, and I've got to say I was a little bit surprised that people described him as a bit of a hothead, a bit of an opinionated guy. He doesn't come across like that certainly in sort of the interviews that he gives and the way that he conducts himself and his demeanour, he doesn't certainly seem like that. Now, Barry Ferguson has gone on to kind of further back his former assistant Neil McCann by saying that Raskin was a handful, was a bit of a hothead, and was on the whole not afraid to challenge ideas and voice his opinions even to Barry Ferguson. And he said that him and Niko butted heads, was his exact words, on a few occasions over tactical decisions, over Niko's role in the side. But Barry emphasised, interestingly, as opposed to Russell Martin, I think, that he likes that debate. He likes passionate players. And he says that helps to overcome complacency and helps to challenge you and keep you on your toes as a manager. I get the feeling that Russell Martin doesn't like to be challenged, doesn't like to have anyone question his methods. And that certainly, to me, goes with what you hear about Martin, about him being tactically inflexible, about him being arrogant, about him being very, very complacent, about him doing it his way or the highway. You know, it's that sort of attitude that Martin has, I think, and has led to Martin spectacularly failing at all three jobs that he's done so far. Barry Ferguson went on to say, he acknowledged that Raskin had strong views on how Rangers should play and regularly communicated that to him throughout his time there. He said there were often heated exchanges in training as well as at game time. But he saw that as a dynamic that was not a problem for him. He said it was a sign of a positive culture where players can push each other for higher standards. Which seems to go against what Russell Martin wants and what Russell Martin sees in terms of the fact that it's Russell Martin's way or no way. If you don't do what the manager says, you're out on your ear. But Ferguson certainly liked that. Ferguson's man management seems very, very different to that of Russell Martin's. Ferguson seems to have that ability to, get the players on side to some degree that Russell Martin doesn't seem to have. He also praised Niko Raskin as well. He said that his attitude and commitment were excellent, and he was, in his words, was a good boy, and expressed admiration for him. He said he highlighted Raskin's assertiveness and drive, which coincided with his strong performances, and he said this intensity was actually beneficial for the team and helped to push the team on. Raskin's drive, his passion, his push, his inability to accept second best was something that was very positive for Rangers in his time there, something that Russell Martin doesn't seem to see to some degree. When he was asked about Raskin's influence, he said that he was a huge talent with the potential to be a very, very top international midfield player. He said that he's influential no matter where you play him in the team. And he also credited Niko Raskin with the progressive style of play that Rangers seem to be taking on towards the end of Barry's time at the club. He said he had been passionate, he had butted heads, there had been arguments on a handful of occasions with Niko, but he said that this energy, this drive was absolutely crucial for success. Look, I'll be honest with you, if you look at the situation with Raskin and you look at how it's kind of been handled under Russell Martin, which I think is very bad. Russell Martin's man management, which has in the past been called into question at other clubs, is not great. And his stubbornness, his inability to change, which is something that fans of Southampton will tell you, fans of Swansea will tell you, fans of MK Dons will tell you, certainly holds the team back and will alienate certain players. Now, if you look at some of the greatest players of all time, and I'm not saying Niko Raskin is one of the greatest players of all time, but you look at some of the top players, they all have personalities, they all have a strength of character, they all have independence of thought. Certainly no more so than Gaza, for example. I mean, Gaza was uncontrollable, but yet Walter somehow got the best out of him. Rene Gattuso, another one, obviously very opinionated, very full of himself as well. There's always been that in top teams. Top players are that way inclined. Top players behave in that way. And it seems that Russell Martin can't handle those top players to me. Hearing what Barry's had to say, you kind of think, well, maybe Barry and Russell Martin should actually sit down and have a chat, and Barry and Russell could learn something from Barry in terms of his man management skills. Now, I'm not saying that Barry is a better manager, even though his management statistics are slightly better than Russell Martin's. And, I criticise Barry massively for what he did as manager of Rangers. And I'm not saying for a minute that we should sack Russell Martin and replace him with Barry Ferguson. I'm not saying that for a minute before anyone comes and says, oh, you're a hypocrite and all this. All I'm saying is that what Barry Ferguson is saying is very interesting to how he dealt with it and how that way of dealing with it, and that allowing Niko to have that assertiveness, that passion, that hot-headedness, got Niko to be one of our best players, to be an outstanding talent for the club. And it just seems to me that Russell Martin is pushing that back and trying to suppress that, and it doesn't serve Rangers in the long run. You know, what we need are players like that who are going to come in, have that passion, have that drive, have that desire. And yes, sometimes they may clash with the manager over certain things, but that happens. That happens all the time. You know, at top football. And someone the other day came at me and said, well, you know, as a manager, if you had that in industry, you know, that man would get the sack. Well, yeah, he probably would, but football is not industry. Football is not retail management. Football is not, you know, business management. Football is a completely separate business. We've said that for a long time. You know, footballers and how you handle footballers is completely different to how you would handle someone who stacks shelves or works on a till or does accounts or does legal things. You know, you don't handle them in the same way. They're different people. They're strung different ways. And for me, the way that Russell Martin is dealing with Barry Ferguson is failing, because it's not allowing, not Barry Ferguson, but Russell Martin is doing Niko Raskin, is failing because it's not getting the best out of Niko, who's clearly one of the best players of the club. And we saw that under Barry. And we saw how Barry, working with that, got Niko Raskin to be one of the best players in Europe at that point last season. And for me, the way that Martin's going is only going to have a negative effect, not only on the club, but also on the player and the player's value long-term for Rangers. And that's something that needs to be addressed. And for me, the blame lies solely at the door of Russell Martin and how he handles Niko Raskin. Raskin is not going to change. He's going to stay like this. This is how he is. Plus how players are. Gaza was like that throughout his entire career. You know, completely out of control. Complete lunatic. And listen to the stories about him. You know, some of the other players that you hear about, you know, are opinionated. They're full of, you know, they're very strong-willed. They're very strong-minded and difficult to control. You know, Roy Keane, for example, is a very strong-minded person. We saw that when he walked out of the Republic of Ireland training camp in the World Cup. You know, Roy Keane was a very strong-minded individual. Yeah, Alex Ferguson, outstanding man manager. No matter what you think of Alex Ferguson, whether you love him, loathe him, whatever, very strong personality. Roy Keane managed superbly by an excellent man manager in Sir Alex. And you know, you had the same you know, clubs like, for example, you know, Arsenal. Again, Tony Adams, strong personality. Martin Keown, strong personality. Patrick Vieira, strong personality, all controlled superbly by outstanding man management from Arsene Wenger. And this is what you see when you've got a manager who is an outstanding manager, who is a good manager. You know, and I'm not saying for a minute we're ever going to get a manager who is in the same class as a Sir Alex or an Arsene Wenger or a Brian Clough, but someone who is a good manager is a good man manager and can deal with different personalities, knows that different people need to be treated in different ways to get the best out of them. The people that you get the best out of by shouting and yelling and screaming at them because that's what they need. There's other players and other people you don't get the best out of by doing that. You have to put an arm around them, be understanding, be kind, be caring. That's how you get the best out of them. And something that Russell Martin seems to massively not be able to do. To me, anyway, given what Barry said today and how Barry has kind of phrased this. Guys, I'd love to know your thoughts on this whole situation. Drop me a comment, let me know your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the content, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.